In 2008, Christopher Nolan did something that Hollywood has spent the last 17 years trying to recreate, and somehow, nobody has succeeded. That might sound strange. After all, The Dark Knight wasn't the last superhero movie ever made. Since its release, audiences have seen hundreds of comic book films. Studios have spent billions of dollars. Marvel built the biggest franchise in movie history. DC launched entire cinematic universes. Some of the most talented directors on the planet have taken their shot. And yet, despite all of that, The Dark Knight still stands alone. Not as one of the greatest superhero movies ever made, but as something far more unusual. A movie that nobody has been able to replicate, and Hollywood noticed, almost immediately. Because when The Dark Knight arrived in theaters, it didn't just make money, it changed expectations. Before 2008, superhero movies were often treated as entertainment. After 2008, they started being treated as cinema. The Dark Knight earned critical acclaim, massive box office numbers, award recognition, and perhaps most importantly, respect. The kind of respect comic book movies rarely received at the time. Suddenly, every studio wanted their own Dark Knight, their own serious superhero film, their own groundbreaking villain, their own Christopher Nolan. And for a while, it looked possible. The formula seemed simple. Make the story darker, make the villains smarter, make everything more realistic. But something strange happened. The more Hollywood tried to copy The Dark Knight, the more they failed. Movies became darker, but not better. More serious, but not more memorable. Bigger budgets, bigger action, bigger universes, yet somehow the gap remained. And that's what makes The Dark Knight so fascinating. Because on paper, it shouldn't be unique anymore. 17 years is a long time. Entire generations of filmmakers have come and gone. Technology has improved. Budgets have exploded. Studios have gained access to resources Nolan could only dream of in 2008. So why hasn't anyone done it again? Why does The Dark Knight still feel different? Why do audiences continue comparing every serious superhero movie to a film released nearly 2 decades ago? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what if the reason nobody could repeat The Dark Knight is because they misunderstood what made it special in the first place? To answer that, we need to go back to the moment Hollywood became obsessed with copying it. Today, it's difficult to remember just how different superhero movies looked before The Dark Knight. Because in 2008, comic book films were still trying to prove themselves. Yes, there had been successes. Spider-Man was huge. X-Men helped bring superheroes into the mainstream. Batman Begins had earned praise for its grounded approach. But despite all of that, most people still viewed superhero movies the same way. Fun, entertaining, disposable. They were blockbusters, not cultural events. Then The Dark Knight arrived and completely changed the conversation. Almost overnight, audiences stopped talking about it like a comic book movie. They talked about it like a crime thriller, a drama, a serious piece of filmmaking. People who had never picked up a Batman comic suddenly wanted to see it. Critics who normally ignored superhero films couldn't stop discussing it. Even those who weren't interested in comic book movies found themselves paying attention. And that's because The Dark Knight wasn't selling audiences on Batman, it was selling them on the story. The movie felt different, the action felt grounded, the world felt believable, the stakes felt real. And at the center of it all was a villain who seemed to step straight out of a completely different genre. The Joker wasn't treated like a comic book character. He felt like a genuine threat, unpredictable, intelligent, terrifying. For many viewers, that changed everything. Because suddenly Hollywood realized something. Superhero movies didn't have to feel like superhero movies. They could be crime films, political thrillers, character studies, psychological dramas. The possibilities had become much larger, and studios immediately took notice. The Dark Knight wasn't just making money, it was making prestige. That's a powerful combination. Anyone can build a blockbuster. Very few movies manage to become cultural landmarks. The Dark Knight had done both. Naturally, every studio wanted the same result. Executives began asking the same question. How do we make our own Dark Knight? How do we create a superhero movie that audiences take seriously? How do we build something that feels important? And at first, the answer seemed obvious. Copy what Nolan did. Make everything darker, more realistic, more mature, more serious. But there was a problem. Hollywood looked at the surface of The Dark Knight, the tone, the visuals, the atmosphere, and completely missed what actually made it work. Because The Dark Knight wasn't great simply because it was dark. In fact, that misunderstanding would become the reason so many studios failed. And over the next decade, Hollywood would spend billions of dollars learning that lesson the hard way. If The Dark Knight changed Hollywood, then Hollywood's response was immediate. Everyone started copying Christopher Nolan. And on the surface, that made perfect sense. After all, the formula seemed obvious. The Dark Knight was darker than most superhero movies, more realistic, more serious. Its villains felt dangerous, its action felt grounded, its world felt believable. So naturally, studios assumed they had figured out the secret. Make everything darker, problem solved. Except that's not what happened. Because while Hollywood was busy copying Nolan's style, they completely missed Nolan's substance. And the difference between those two things is enormous. Almost overnight, superhero movies started changing. Heroes became more serious, stories became more cynical, colors became more muted, jokes became less frequent. Marketing campaigns began emphasizing realism and maturity. Studios weren't just inspired by The Dark Knight, they were chasing it, desperately. And for a while, audiences were excited. The industry appeared to be evolving. Comic book movies were growing up. At least, that's what everyone thought. But then something strange started happening. Many of these darker movies felt forgettable. Some were successful, some weren't, but very few generated the same reaction as The Dark Knight. The same discussions, the same cultural impact, the same staying power. And that confused people, because on paper, Hollywood was doing exactly what audiences claimed they wanted. More mature stories, more serious characters, more realistic worlds. Yet something was missing. The problem was that darkness had never been the point. The Dark Knight wasn't great because it was dark. It was dark because that tone served the story Nolan wanted to tell. The realism wasn't the goal. It was a tool. The grounded world wasn't what made the movie memorable. The characters were. The conflict was. The tension was. The themes were. Christopher Nolan didn't wake up one morning and decide to make Batman darker. He built a world where darkness felt natural, where every creative choice supported the story. Many of the films that followed worked backwards. They started with the darkness, then tried to build a story around it. And audiences could feel the difference, whether they realized it or not. Because viewers are surprisingly good at detecting authenticity. They know when a movie genuinely has something to say, and they know when a movie is simply trying to imitate another successful movie. That's why so many so-called Dark Knight clones disappeared from public memory. They copied the appearance, but not the foundation. And nowhere was that failure more obvious than at the studio that should have had the easiest time succeeding. Because if anyone should have been able to recreate The Dark Knight, it was DC themselves. If Hollywood misunderstood The Dark Knight, then there was one studio that should have understood it better than anyone else. DC. After all, they owned Batman. They owned Gotham. They owned the entire universe that made The Dark Knight possible. If anyone was capable of creating another Dark Knight, it should have been them. And for a moment, it looked like they might actually pull it off. Because following Christopher Nolan's success, Warner Brothers found themselves in an incredible position. They had some of the most recognizable superheroes in the world: Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, characters that had been iconic for generations. The plan seemed simple: build a larger universe, take the serious tone audiences loved, apply it to other heroes, create something even bigger. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, quite a lot. The biggest problem was that many people inside the industry learned the wrong lesson from The Dark Knight. They looked at the darkness, the realism, the serious atmosphere, and assumed those things were responsible for the movie's success. But those weren't the reason audiences loved The Dark Knight. They were simply the result of Nolan's storytelling. Yet DC kept chasing the result instead of the cause. Nowhere was this more obvious than with Superman, because Superman presented a unique challenge. He's not Batman. Batman thrives in darkness. Superman doesn't. Batman is built around fear. Superman is built around hope. They're fundamentally different characters. Yet when audiences finally saw Superman return to the big screen, many immediately noticed something familiar. The darker tone, the grounded approach, the emphasis on realism. The influence of The Dark Knight was everywhere. And while some viewers loved it, others felt something wasn't quite right. The movie wasn't failing because it lacked quality. It was failing because it was trying to fit a different hero into a framework that wasn't designed for him. Then came an even bigger test. Batman versus Superman. On paper, this should have been a guaranteed success. Batman and Superman together for the first time in a major live-action film. Two of the most famous fictional characters ever created. A massive budget, huge anticipation. Everything DC could possibly need. And yet the reaction was divisive. Very divisive. Once again, audiences felt like something was missing. The movie looked serious. It sounded serious. It wanted to be important. But it never generated the same connection that The Dark Knight had. Because The Dark Knight wasn't respected simply because it was mature. It was respected because every element worked together. The characters, the themes, the conflict, the storytelling. You can't recreate that by making a movie darker. And that's the lesson DC kept learning over and over again. The more they tried to recreate The Dark Knight's formula, the further away they got from what made it special. But DC wasn't the only studio paying attention, because while they were busy chasing Nolan's approach, Marvel was preparing to do something completely different. And that decision changed superhero movies forever. While DC spent years trying to recreate The Dark Knight, Marvel made a very different decision. They decided not to. At first, that sounds completely backwards. Why would anyone ignore the most successful superhero movie of its generation? Especially when the entire industry was trying to copy it. The answer is surprisingly simple. Marvel understood something that many studios didn't. The Dark Knight had already happened, and trying to make another one would only invite comparison. A comparison almost no movie could survive. Think about it. The moment a studio announces a darker, Batman-style superhero film, audiences immediately start comparing it to The Dark Knight. The villain gets compared to the Joker. The hero gets compared to Batman. The story gets compared to Nolan's writing. Everything gets compared. And that's a dangerous game. Because even great movies can look disappointing when measured against a masterpiece. Marvel knew this. So instead of chasing Nolan's formula, they went in the opposite direction. Rather than becoming darker, they became lighter. Rather than focusing on realism, they embraced comic books. Rather than grounding everything in reality, they built a universe where gods, aliens, and super soldiers could exist together. At the time, this was a huge risk. Remember, The Dark Knight had convinced Hollywood that audiences wanted mature realism. Marvel was betting on something completely different. Fun, humor, escapism, color, and most importantly, interconnected storytelling. Instead of asking how to become the next Dark Knight, Marvel asked a different question. What can we do that nobody else is doing? That decision changed everything. Because while studios were busy copying Christopher Nolan, Marvel was busy creating its own identity. Movie after movie, audiences became invested in characters rather than tone. Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, the Avengers. Each film felt connected to something larger. And suddenly, the conversation changed. People stopped asking who would create the next Dark Knight. They started asking who would build the next Marvel universe. It's one of the biggest shifts in modern Hollywood history. The Dark Knight had changed superhero movies. Marvel changed the business model. And that's why comparing the two is so difficult. They were solving different problems. One was trying to create the best standalone superhero movie possible. The other was trying to create the biggest shared universe ever assembled. Ironically, Marvel's greatest success may have actually proven the Dark Knight's uniqueness. Because instead of replacing it, they built an entirely different path. A path so successful that the entire industry eventually followed them instead. Yet despite Marvel's dominance, one problem remained. A problem that no studio ever managed to solve. Because while you can copy a tone, and you can copy a business strategy, there's one thing you can't manufacture. And that was the very thing sitting at the center of The Dark Knight, the Joker. Or more specifically, the performance that made him unforgettable. If you ask most people why The Dark Knight is still unmatched, they'll usually give the same answer. The Joker. And honestly, they're not completely wrong. Because after 17 years, Hollywood still hasn't produced another villain quite like him. What's interesting, though, is that studios have spent almost 2 decades trying. Over and over again. The logic seemed simple. If audiences loved the Joker, then all you needed was another unforgettable villain. Another scene stealer. Another character who could dominate every conversation. And for years, Hollywood chased exactly that. Some came close. A few became iconic. But none created the same effect. And the reason is surprisingly complicated. Because Heath Ledger's Joker wasn't just a great villain. He arrived at the perfect moment. Think about what made the character so powerful. It wasn't his costume. It wasn't the makeup. It wasn't even the performance alone. It was the uncertainty. Every time the Joker appeared on screen, audiences genuinely had no idea what would happen next. Most movie villains operate within clear rules. They want money, power, revenge, control, something. The Joker felt different. Even when he explained his motivations, nobody fully believed him. His stories changed. His plans seemed irrational. His actions felt unpredictable. And that made him terrifying. Not because he was powerful, because he was impossible to understand. That's a very difficult thing to write, and an even harder thing to perform. Which is why so many villains that followed felt familiar. They were memorable, but understandable. Audiences could predict them, analyze them, place them into categories. The Joker resisted all of that. The more you tried to understand him, the more mysterious he became. And that's only part of the story. Because another reason the performance became legendary was the movie surrounding it. This is something people often forget. The Joker didn't exist in a vacuum. He existed inside an incredible film. A film that constantly gave him meaningful opponents, meaningful choices, meaningful consequences. Without Batman, Harvey Dent, Gordon, and Gotham itself, the Joker wouldn't have had the same impact. The character worked because everything around him worked. And that's where so many imitators failed. They focused on creating the next Joker, the next shocking villain, the next internet obsession. But they ignored the ecosystem that made the Joker possible. A great villain can elevate a movie, but a great villain alone cannot create a Dark Knight. And that's exactly why Hollywood kept falling short. Because the secret ingredient wasn't just the Joker. In fact, the most important ingredient might have been something else entirely. Something audiences rarely talk about. And something almost no studio has ever managed to replicate. At this point, it might seem like we've found the answer. The Dark Knight is unmatched because of the Joker. Case closed. Except there's one problem. If that were true, The Dark Knight wouldn't be the only great movie with a great villain. History is full of unforgettable villains. Darth Vader, Hannibal Lecter, Anton Chigurh, Hans Landa, Thanos. The list goes on and on. Great villains aren't unique to The Dark Knight. So why does this movie still feel different? Why does it continue to occupy a place that so few superhero films have ever reached? The answer lies in something most audiences never think about. The Dark Knight wasn't actually built around Batman or the Joker. It was built around conflict. Not physical conflict, ideological conflict. And that's a huge difference. Because most superhero movies are ultimately asking a simple question. Can the hero stop the villain? The Dark Knight is asking something much more interesting. Can the hero stay the hero? That distinction changes everything. Throughout the entire film, the Joker isn't trying to defeat Batman, at least not physically. He's trying to prove a point, a terrifying point, that everyone is just as broken as he is, that morality is an illusion, that order is fragile, that given enough pressure, anyone will become a monster. Batman isn't fighting for Gotham's safety. He's fighting for Gotham's soul. And that's what makes the movie so compelling. Every major character becomes part of the same argument. Harvey Dent, Commissioner Gordon, the citizens on the ferries, even Batman himself. They're all being tested, not by strength, not by power, but by choice. The Joker creates situations where every decision matters, every sacrifice matters, every moral compromise matters. And because of that, every scene carries tension. Not because audiences are wondering what will happen, but because they're wondering what people will choose. That's a much rarer form of storytelling, and it's also much harder to replicate. You can spend hundreds of millions of dollars recreating Gotham. You can hire great actors. You can write a memorable villain. But creating a story where every character embodies a different side of the same philosophical conflict? That's incredibly difficult. Christopher Nolan didn't just make a superhero movie. He built a pressure cooker. A machine designed to force every character toward impossible decisions. And that's why The Dark Knight feels so different from most of the films that followed. Many movies copied the darkness. Some copied the realism. Others tried to create their own Joker. Very few copied the thing that actually mattered. The conflict beneath the surface. The engine driving every scene. And that leads to an even stranger realization. Because if The Dark Knight's greatness came from a combination of factors this specific, then maybe Hollywood never had a real chance of repeating it in the first place. In fact, the strongest evidence for that theory might be Christopher Nolan himself. Because even Nolan never made another Dark Knight. By now, the answer seems obvious. The Dark Knight wasn't just a great superhero movie. It was a perfect combination of factors that rarely come together. The right director, the right cast, the right story, the right villain, the right moment in time. But there's one piece of evidence that makes this argument even stronger. Christopher Nolan himself. Because if anyone should have been capable of making another Dark Knight, it was the man who made the first one. And yet, he never did. That's not a criticism. In fact, it may be the strongest proof of The Dark Knight's uniqueness. Think about Nolan's career after 2008. Most directors would spend years trying to recreate their biggest success. Nolan did the opposite. He moved on. Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk, Tenet, Oppenheimer, one ambitious project after another. Many of them became critically acclaimed. Several became cultural phenomena. Some even won major awards. Yet despite all of those achievements, audiences never stopped comparing them to The Dark Knight. And that's fascinating. Because Nolan wasn't trying to make another Dark Knight. He was trying to make completely different films. Different genres, different themes, different stories. Yet the comparison followed him everywhere. Why? Because audiences weren't comparing plots, they were comparing impact, the feeling, the experience. That rare sensation of watching a movie and immediately realizing you're seeing something special. And that's much harder to manufacture than people think. Great directors make great movies all the time. Very few create cultural landmarks. The kind of films that reshape expectations for an entire genre. The Dark Knight did exactly that. Which is why even Nolan's later masterpieces occupy a different category. People admire Interstellar. They respect Oppenheimer. They debate Tenet. But The Dark Knight became something else. A benchmark. A reference point. A movie people use to measure other movies. And once a film reaches that level, repeating it becomes almost impossible. Because audiences aren't simply asking whether the next movie is good. They're asking whether it feels as important, whether it leaves the same mark, whether it changes the conversation. That's an unfair standard, but it's also the reality The Dark Knight created. Ironically, Nolan may have understood this better than anyone, which is why he never attempted to recreate it. He didn't spend years chasing another Joker. He didn't try to make a darker Batman sequel every few years. He kept moving forward. Because he likely understood something Hollywood didn't. You cannot deliberately create lightning in a bottle. You can build the conditions. You can assemble incredible talent. You can tell a great story. But moments like The Dark Knight aren't manufactured. They happen. And that's exactly why, 17 years later, we're still talking about it. But there's one film that came closer than any other. A movie that reminded audiences of The Dark Knight in ways nobody expected. And for a moment, some people even wondered if it might finally be the successor they'd been waiting for. For years, every serious superhero movie faced the same problem. Sooner or later, someone would compare it to The Dark Knight. Most of those comparisons ended quickly. The movies simply weren't close. But in 2022, something unusual happened. A Batman movie arrived that felt different. Not because it copied Christopher Nolan, but because it understood some of the same principles. That movie was The Batman. And for the first time in a very long time, audiences started asking a question that hadn't been asked in years. Could this finally be the successor to The Dark Knight? At first, the comparison seemed obvious. Both films were grounded. Both took their characters seriously. Both focused on atmosphere over spectacle. And both treated Gotham like a real place rather than a comic book playground. But the deeper people looked, the more interesting the comparison became. Because The Batman wasn't trying to become The Dark Knight. It was trying to become something else entirely. Christopher Nolan built a crime epic. Matt Reeves built a detective story. Nolan's Gotham felt like a city under attack. Reeves' Gotham felt like a city already rotting from the inside. The goals were different. The themes were different. The experiences were different. And yet audiences couldn't stop comparing them. That's because The Batman achieved something most superhero films never manage. It created an identity. The movie felt confident, deliberate, focused. It wasn't chasing trends. It wasn't trying to set up 10 future projects. It wasn't obsessed with building a cinematic universe. It was simply trying to tell one story as well as possible. Ironically, that's one of the qualities that made people think of The Dark Knight in the first place. Not the darkness, not the realism, the confidence. The sense that the filmmakers knew exactly what movie they wanted to make. And for a while, it worked. Critics praised it. Audiences embraced it. Fans began discussing it alongside Nolan's trilogy, a rare achievement in itself. Yet despite all of that, something interesting happened. The comparison never truly disappeared. People still preferred The Dark Knight. Not all people, but enough to keep the conversation alive. And that's where we discover something important. The Batman may have come closer than anyone else, but even it wasn't trying to replicate The Dark Knight. It was creating its own path. Just like Marvel did. Just like Nolan did after 2008. Just like every successful filmmaker eventually does. Because the closer you look at The Dark Knight, the more one fact becomes impossible to ignore. The films that succeed aren't the ones trying to copy it. They're the ones trying to be something else. Which raises a bigger question. What if the real reason nobody could repeat The Dark Knight has nothing to do with talent? What if the industry itself changed in ways that made another Dark Knight almost impossible to create? And that's where the story becomes even more interesting. By this point, a pattern starts to emerge. The studios that tried to copy The Dark Knight failed. The studios that ignored it found their own success. Even Christopher Nolan never attempted to recreate it. And the closer we look, the harder it becomes to avoid one conclusion. Maybe the problem isn't the filmmakers. Maybe the problem is the era. Because The Dark Knight didn't just arrive at the perfect moment. It arrived in a completely different Hollywood. A Hollywood that barely exists anymore. Think back to 2008. There was no Disney-dominated superhero landscape. No endless streaming war. No cinematic universes releasing multiple projects every year. No social media machine dissecting every casting choice, trailer, and rumor months before release. Movies had room to breathe. Audiences had room to be surprised. And surprise was one of The Dark Knight's greatest weapons. Today, major films are analyzed long before they reach theaters. Every set photo becomes a headline. Every leak becomes a discussion. Every creative decision becomes a debate. By the time a movie is released, audiences often feel like they've already seen half of it. The Dark Knight benefited from something that's becoming increasingly rare: mystery. People knew Batman. People knew the Joker. But they didn't know what Christopher Nolan was about to do with them. The movie still had the power to shock, to surprise, to dominate the cultural conversation. That's much harder today. But that's only part of the story. The bigger change happened inside the industry itself. Modern blockbuster filmmaking has become increasingly interconnected. Studios don't just make movies anymore. They build ecosystems, franchises, universes, long-term roadmaps. Every project is expected to set up another project. Every ending is expected to tease another beginning. Every success is expected to become a brand. The Dark Knight existed in a very different environment. Its primary goal wasn't expansion. It wasn't world-building. It wasn't preparing audiences for 6 future installments. Its goal was simply to be the best movie it could be. That sounds obvious, but it's actually rare. Because when filmmakers are forced to think about future projects, spin-offs, and shared universes, creative priorities inevitably shift. The story is no longer the only thing that matters. The franchise matters too. Christopher Nolan largely avoided that problem. He was allowed to focus on the film in front of him, not the next 5 films behind it. And that freedom shows. Every scene feels purposeful. Every character serves the story. Every decision pushes the narrative forward. Nothing feels like setup. Nothing feels like homework. The movie exists entirely in the present. And that's one of the reasons it continues to feel timeless. Because it wasn't designed to launch something. It was designed to stand on its own. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. The reason The Dark Knight still feels different after all these years isn't just about the Joker, or Batman, or Christopher Nolan. It's about something much bigger. Something that explains why audiences continue returning to it long after so many other blockbusters have faded away. At this point, we've talked about the Joker, Christopher Nolan, Hollywood, DC, Marvel, the Batman. And yet, none of those explanations fully answer the question. Because if The Dark Knight's success came down to just one factor, someone would have replicated it by now. But they haven't. Which suggests something much more interesting. Maybe The Dark Knight feels different because it was never trying to be what we now call a superhero movie. Think about the films people compare it to. Most superhero movies are built around spectacle. The action, the powers, the visual effects. The larger-than-life moments audiences pay to see. The Dark Knight certainly had those things. But that's not what people remember. When audiences talk about The Dark Knight, they rarely start with the action scenes. They talk about the interrogation room, the fairy dilemma, Harvey Dent's transformation, the Joker's philosophy, the impossible choices, the tension, the conversations. And that's unusual, because most blockbusters are remembered for what happened. The Dark Knight is remembered for what it made people think about. That's a very different kind of impact. Christopher Nolan understood something many filmmakers still struggle to understand. People don't remember movies because they're big. They remember movies because they feel important. The Dark Knight felt important. Not because Batman was fighting criminals, but because the movie was asking questions that extended beyond Gotham. Questions about fear, order, chaos, justice, morality, human nature. The film trusted its audience. It didn't simplify its ideas. It didn't stop every few minutes to explain itself. It allowed viewers to engage with the story on a deeper level. And that's one of the reasons it continues attracting new audiences. A teenager watching The Dark Knight today often discovers something different than someone who watched it in 2008. The themes age well because they're universal. The movie isn't tied to a trend, or a specific moment in internet culture, or a cinematic universe. It's tied to questions people never stop asking. And that's where so many imitators ran into trouble. They copied the darkness, but not the depth. They copied the realism, but not the tension. They copied the tone, but not the ideas. The result was movies that looked similar on the surface while feeling completely different underneath. Because audiences can sense when a story has something meaningful to say, and they can sense when a story is borrowing the appearance of meaning. The Dark Knight never needed to convince people it was important. It simply was. Which is why 17 years later, people are still discussing it, still debating it, still comparing new releases to it. Not because it's perfect, but because it achieved something incredibly rare. It became bigger than its genre. And once a film reaches that level, comparison stops being fair. The movie is no longer competing against other superhero films. It's competing against history. And that's what finally brings us to the real answer. The reason nobody could repeat The Dark Knight isn't because Hollywood didn't try. It's because they were trying to recreate the result. Instead of understanding the cause, 17 years later, Hollywood is still chasing The Dark Knight. And by now, the reason should be obvious. They were never chasing a movie. They were chasing a moment. Because throughout this entire story, one question has followed us from beginning to end. Why couldn't anyone do it again? Why couldn't DC recreate it? Why couldn't Marvel recreate it? Why couldn't countless directors, writers, and studios recreate it? And perhaps most importantly, why couldn't even Christopher Nolan recreate it? The answer isn't that they lack talent. Many of the people who tried are among the most successful filmmakers alive today. The answer isn't money either. Modern blockbusters routinely spend more than The Dark Knight ever did. The answer isn't technology. Visual effects have improved dramatically since 2008. In many ways, Hollywood has more resources than ever before. What it doesn't have is the exact set of circumstances that made The Dark Knight possible. Because great movies are rarely created by formulas. They're created by collisions. The collision of the right filmmaker, the right story, the right actors, the right audience, the right cultural moment, all happening at exactly the right time. Take away any one of those elements and the result changes. Maybe not completely, but enough. The Dark Knight wasn't simply a well-made superhero movie. It arrived at the exact moment audiences were ready for it. A moment when comic book films were still evolving. A moment when realism felt fresh. A moment when nobody knew what a superhero movie could become. Christopher Nolan pushed the genre forward. And once that happens, the surprise is gone forever. That's the strange thing about innovation. The first person changes the game. Everyone else plays on the new field. Which is why every attempt to recreate The Dark Knight was ultimately doomed from the start. You can't surprise audiences with the same surprise twice. You can't revolutionize a genre in the exact same way again. The moment has already passed. And that's what so many people misunderstand when they ask why nobody has topped The Dark Knight. Because the goal was never to top it. The goal was to create the next great thing, just as The Dark Knight once did. Some films succeeded, some didn't. But none of them were supposed to be another Dark Knight. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson of all. The movies that came closest weren't the ones trying to copy Christopher Nolan. They were the ones bold enough to become something entirely different. That's what Marvel understood. That's what Matt Reeves understood. That's what Nolan himself understood. Great films don't emerge from imitation. They emerge from vision. Which brings us back to where we started. 17 years have passed. Hundreds of superhero movies have been released. Billions of dollars have been spent. Yet The Dark Knight still occupies a place no other film has managed to take. Not because it's flawless, not because it's untouchable, but because it achieved something incredibly rare. It became the standard. And once a movie becomes the standard, people stop judging it against its competition. They judge the competition against it. That's why we're still talking about The Dark Knight. That's why new superhero movies are still compared to it. And that's why, after all these years, Hollywood isn't really trying to remake The Dark Knight. It's still trying to create the next movie that changes everything. Just like The Dark Knight once did.